Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you. Thank you for all coming out this evening. We appreciate you braving your early evening to come and spend some time with us to talk about cannabis in Novato. My name is Michael Antwine. I'm one of the two assistant city managers here with the city of Novato. This evening we'll be talking about, this is a third series of workshops to talk about proposed cannabis regulations here in the city of Novato. We've talked a little bit about public safety. We've talked about compliance and regulations. Today we'll talk a little bit about youth access, as well as some land use regulations as well. Currently, the city has a moratorium as it relates to cannabis use in the city. We do have, within that moratorium, we do have some exceptions where we do allow for delivery of medical cannabis, and we also have two businesses that have a testing lab and a manufacturing facility that were pre-existing businesses. But part of this process is to develop a comprehensive regulatory framework for the city as it relates to cannabis and to the various cannabis activities. So we've had a pretty robust outreach process over the last month. We've held probably 6 or 7 meetings between internal staff meetings, meeting with industry professionals, various community meetings to get a wide array and range of input and feedback as to how cannabis activities should look in Novato. So, we are excited to have the opportunity to, continue that process this evening and also to get your feedback. As part of this evening's meeting, we'll also have a panel this evening. We'll have a panel of industry professionals from the retail as well as testing and manufacturing to really answer some questions about cannabis and give you some real life examples of how that looks, what maybe the business model is as well. And to engage in this process, the city hired the firm of HDL, who is a well-known firm in this field and as well as in other areas of municipal and government relations. And so we have David McPherson here, who's the president, and he'll be going over the presentation this evening. A couple of housekeeping items. Please make sure that you haven't, please sign in at the table there in the back. We also have a link to our website there, and we have a lot of information to make sure that you stay engaged in the process. There's a survey that's online. We hope that you do take that survey. We've been having a lot of good feedback from that survey. And also, as we continue to move forward, we have a notification process to allow you to stay engaged with the future activities. We anticipate to conclude this outreach process within the next 2 to 3 weeks. And from that, we'll be formulating all of the input and feedback and providing a report to the city council for them to then begin to make some deliberations to determine what any type of cannabis program would look like in Novato. And so we intend to have that completed by November and have some type of final framework of cannabis ordinance and regulations. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to David McPherson to deal with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So, since everything's a little behind me and bigger, I'm going to have to read my stuff here. So, as he had mentioned, there been a series of classes, and today's, let's move it over. So, part of the outreach, and we had actually had the business community this morning, we had discussion with them. And so, as the city does outreach, there's also outreach to the industry, and I think when we do some of the panels, they can talk about the value of that and the importance of it, but from a perspective from a regulator and someone that's administered from the city side, I wanted to share with you some of my thoughts regarding some of the experiences associated with that. So, on the government side, looking at outreach, as you bring in industry and not only the collaboration component of it, but also how it affects people around you as a business. And when we were working with businesses on the outreach component of it, we built it into the regulations or the city ordinance that they have to establish. Part of the criteria is to establish a liaison for their business so that when businesses around them have problems or concerns regarding issues, they've got someone to go to. They have, if there's complaints from citizens, part of the goal of the city is to kind of direct it to the business liaison person to try to facilitate some of the issues or concerns so that the city is not necessarily having to deal with those issues at the first level. Now, of course, when things don't go the way each side like to see it to, and it happens on occasion, then that's where the city would kind of step in on that. The other thing that we have seen industry do, and is a good practice, not something that's required, but it's a good practice that we recommend in establishing as a city rapport, is not only along with that liaison stuff, is that we've seen them where they've actually put signs out, little signs that say, do you have any concerns regarding this business? Please contact us, at this number. So that usually goes to the liaison. Just like you drive down the street and you see a car driving, a truck driver, and it says, you have any concerns regarding this driver, please call this number, kind of like that. And so you can address your concerns and it just doesn't go ignored, and you've got some kind of relationship to address the issues. The second thing that we've seen, and I think has been very unique in some of that approach, is we've actually seen businesses actually do open houses before they officially open, because of course you can't go in there once they're open, but actually do open houses to their neighbors so they can see that, hey, we're like no other business in town, and we want you to see that what's in this building is no secret or surprise to you. And they kind of do, a little education and outreach to you to just kind of show that we're here to partner with you as a community, we're here to partner with other businesses, and we don't want this mystique of we're something unique or different on that. So that helps on the outreach component of it. And we would encourage that as we look to that in addressing some of the issues that we see that occurring, and I think some of that will be touched upon in some of the panel stuff. So throughout the various panels that we've done, both to the communities and to the stakeholder meetings, is that we talk about this throughout the whole process, and we've done also address this to the council when we did our first workshop with them, is that focusing whatever you do on the core values, the 4 focus values. And we've talked about public safety to a great degree on the last presentation, and then what a good business, bad business looks like on one of the Saturday workshops, and part of the environmental impacts and issues that are associated with that. Today we want to focus on the next 2 categories a little more. One is the land use protection, what it does of the businesses, and especially as we address it and transition into the impacts to minors and the access to use, and what can be done and what are the issues associated with that. So with that said, part of the community goals in that should be to focus on how do you keep underage exposure to cannabis. I don't think there's anyone in this room, both from a community or industry, have any desire to get this in the hands or want this in the hands of minors, nor does, just like you do with other alcohol or tobacco type situations. And also addressing some of the disorders even from adult uses as far as concerns of safety, overusage, how to properly use them either as a medicine or as an adult use product, and making sure that there's education associated with that, not only from a city side, but also from an industry side, and what requirements can be provided to promote that in part of the process. And of course, we can reiterate back to the public health and the public safety component of this, which is essential in the core values. And then again, we mentioned that already the protection of the environment, of what things on, more on the retail side of it, it's not going to be as critical, but on the other side, when we talk about manufacturing or cultivation or other impacts of the business or the type of activities will be critical. But today we're going to focus more on the buffer zone issue and looking at what we're doing for unlawful production component of it. As we mentioned, we wanted to really focus on the first part of this, of looking at it, access to youth. So a broader availability of what that means, how do you reduce that, what makes it easier for access to the youth, or what doesn't, so you're making sure that whatever that low-hanging fruit component of it, where they get exposure to that it's eliminated or controlled to make sure it's not addressed. As alcohol came in about and over the years of experience of addressing, where kids were going to liquor stores and trying to convince someone to buy them product, kind of what it does here, it has a unique difference as far as how that can be oversight to that, where you don't have it at a liquor store or even, getting access to bars of underage. So legalization could also lead you to believe that the cannabis is completely safe, and so, where there's education of where there's a product is good for people that have certain certain ailments as youth, and with the proper doctor's oversight, things of that nature, there is appropriate education to that. But also the myth that they think that they get comfortable with this product, just like they get comfortable with alcohol, that while it's not that bad or harmful, that becomes a very important part of how they are educated and make sure that the rates of youth access stays down. And we're going to talk about a study that just recently came out as well. Because as we know, and it's been said enough, as we become into a regulated world, or how much it impacts a youth brain and how the development of that brain under the age of 24 has some impact of that. So trying to make sure that they're not exposed to that becomes very critical. So there's been surveys that have gone out about surveying youth about their access to this. Interesting enough, the survey that was in the 2015 poll that did throughout the United States, not just regionally where cannabis is being sold both legally, but throughout, they pretty much say that it's fairly easy access to it. And I don't think that's any surprise because of a black market that doesn't have any interest to try to eliminate that or discourage that. But ironically, a poll that just came out in the last 2 weeks actually did a poll where it tested almost 1,500 kids or surveyed them through a variety of areas in jurisdictions, that it said that the actual uses is still in the 20% range. So although they believe that there's easy access to it, it doesn't mean that there's an overwhelming higher degree of usage of that hasn't been. And it talked about Colorado, where the youth before 2014, or I mean through 2012, where it was somewhere in the range between 17 and 18%, and of course when it became legal and recreational, that it did jump up a couple points, but all of a sudden now it's actually phasing out back to where it was prior to that time. So we're maybe youth are exploring with this, and then all of a sudden saying, okay, well, I've got over exploring at this. It's not that risky of why the peer pressure of doing it has changed, and I think better education by parents and marketing to kids about what's good and what's bad about it and what the impacts are to them. But some of the successful strategies that we've seen on cities that have looked into this really has to do with addressing buffer zones and making sure that you don't have a density of too many locations or access to them. This is mostly on the retail side. Make sure that that is there, and then putting proper things in place where they're not getting exposure to it or there's not as much concern of that. Historically, what we have seen for the last probably 6 to 8 years is dealing with a rogue industry or an industry that was black market that all of a sudden becomes co-op and collectives, and they're not under the oversight, and cities were just kind of letting them exist and not doing anything about them, versus really taking a good oversight and creating regulations. And of course, with the state now creating a bigger, robust criteria for them and shifting who's involved in these businesses, and you're seeing other people getting involved with this business. There are former tech people, former doctors, former investors, developers, people that see this as an opportunity of a new business, and even other retailers that were in other businesses that were in restaurant businesses, agriculture businesses, getting involved in this, and it's really shaping who is involved in these industries and what they're doing to make sure youth are not exposed to this or access to it. So some of the regulations that are going to help this, that have come through the new regulations, is where access to some places are not on the adult side, is people can't get access to it until they're 21, or being allowed in certain facilities until they're 21, versus just in the medical side of it, when you're 18 years old, and kids that were in high school or seniors were able to go in as 18-year-olds and get access to this. As things are transforming and there's more requirements put in this, and how much product can be sold and go out the door limits that in oversight and control, because as we go into a track and trace system, they're going to be limited on how much product that's even can be sneaked out the door and try to resold to use. And so with that said, not only who they can sell it to, but also they're going to employ in some of these facilities, will help facilitate that where there's some better responsible people working in them as there's more controls. And more importantly is that as you get into a regulated world, which we've experienced a lot in the Novato and Colorado where we have staff that work on those, is that you can do undercover and routine inspections on this, and you'd be surprised at how much that cleans up, because when people know they're watching them, then their accountability goes up, because the owners are very critical and not letting their employees get complacent on a lot of these things, and it really shapes some of the perception of employees, which cause a lot of the problems which we have talked about in some of the other presentations. Some of the things that industry is doing and even the cities are doing in consideration is in making sure that they have proper equipment to check IDs. It's so easy to get fake IDs that having proper mechanisms in place and requiring some of those requirements, and of course we're starting to see California just recently transition to having, everyone here is probably going to have to know by 2020 get a different driver's license with different things. And I just recently did mine in August, and now they take your fingerprint, they do other information, do a lot more robust requirements in order to get a new ID that you're going to do. You can't falsify things, and it makes it a lot easier to create fake IDs. So we address community regulations as we talked about in a variety of ways, and the strategies to address that. One of the things that we see more and more happening, and then the state's doing this too, is requiring certain education from the staff that work at these facilities. And in some cases, we're seeing a lot of cities, and we recommend that is that they're doing responsible bud tendering training requirements, so that they know not only what they're educating the bud tenders of their legal liability and responsibility, but also the do's and don'ts of the law, because you'd be surprised how much in a transformation world of regulations that they don't do that. So that's becoming more of a norm than a recommendation. They're already having to do it to get qualified for the track and trace requirement. And so this is one more thing that I think we see businesses doing to make sure that they stay out of trouble and that their people know what they should be doing. Requiring the use of technology that improves the accuracy of verification processes. Again, as we said, with the fake ID processes, our ability, this eliminates it as technology allows us to check things a little more and keep people out, and no surprise, or said I checked the ID and there's not a qualified cell. We mentioned about the compliance checks, not only doing routines of that, but part of the process is doing routine inspections that are done 3 or 4 times a year to validate what they're putting into the systems, make sure what they're tracking and verifying information, and becomes critical, other than the spot checking component of that, and that keeps the dealing with the minor issues to a low. To the degree it is, just like alcohol, you're still going to have some of that billboards. The more you see in front of a TV, the more you hear on the radio, the more they see it in print, it becomes a norm to them and a condition to them that this is something that gets in their head. And so the state has state laws that expressly prohibit advertising that's geared and appealed towards children. It was actually written in Prop 64 as well. The cities typically will have certain requirements. We talked this morning about limitations of not having sandwich boards or having people walk around, or cars, advertising on cars, and how they advertise becomes, trying to reduce that so it's not exposed to the youth becomes very important process, and a good responsibility business as well. So as we move on to the second discussion of land use, this is the breakdown of the city's zoning sections. And so we will be coming back to council soon with GIS maps, looking at the sensitive buffers for youth facilities, daycares, and K through 12 schools to kind of show where all these locations are and with the buffers, where it means to them and what type of zone areas that certain things can or cannot be just by its natural where it's at, not necessarily where the council may consider trying to restrict certain types of activities in there. But typically retail, a dispensary is going to be pretty much in a retail looking location, but you may see that it could be in a commercial location depending on where it may even be considered. And again, as Michael said, this is only if council even considers moving forward with consideration of the various types of activities. And we always come back to this part of the discussion too in the regulations that's not only going to do with the concerns of the minors, but concerns with the other business community and how it impacts the traffic flow, how it impacts communities, neighborhoods as well, and the time, place, and manner issues. And so if we're directed to move forward to outline best practices of a regulatory ordinance, we'll be addressing a lot of the concerns that, one, we hope that the survey, that the results from the survey will give us some direction as far as what may be the sensitive issues of the community or those that respond to the survey, and secondly, direction from council, and then the feedback from best practices in there. So one of the things that we find statistically does have an impact strategically for the youth access is limiting on not only where it's at in control, where it's a more transparent environment to exposure, where there's high traffic of both pedestrians, so it's not they're just hiding around dark corners, but also where police patrol more frequency and there's a lot more exposure into the light, but also the hours in which a business may be open. This is not one of those, go to the liquor store at 11 o'clock at night because you need something. This is something you can plan a little more for, just like deliveries of where there may be restrictions, but also limiting where their hours are going to be in certain places, so it's a little more controlled and restrictive on where youth could get access to it and where there's more oversight from public safety folks in certain zones. So enacting restrictions that are attractive to children, one of the things that we have a challenge with is what is defined in state law. The state law talks about a youth center or what a youth is, and sometimes that's very difficult to what type of activities. And when we talk about, is Chuck E. Cheese considered a place that would be for youth groups? Is a yoga place that's in the middle of town considered a youth group? Places that aren't commonly looked at as places that are youth, is that something that in the definition, how does that affect different communities? And at the same time is what looks attractive to children, and how do you keep things away about areas that they're exposed to become part of the discussion process. Along with that is mimicking the advertising that's associated with around some of those areas. And state law restricts where some of this can be, but what we don't want to see is signs that clearly that will, like this, that's going to tell you, right, visible to children that look attractive to them, and not only where they're at, but how many there and the frequency of where that goes down up and down highways, what it may be downtown, what billboards are going to say, to keep it to a minimum. And as I already mentioned before, the restrictions on the advertising on both radio, print, digital, and so forth, where things can be. So state law also has restrictions on advertising around schools, and even in possession or consuming it when you're within 1,000 feet of a school, daycare center, or youth center. Now, the 1,000 foot is more of exposure to that or advertising or even in possession or use of, unless of course you're in your backyard and the school is behind you, is a different story. But it limits that. So there's part of that, how we're going to restrictive of the access to minors, so they're not seeing this going to and from school or sitting out in front of the playground or things of that nature, and how that advertising comes into play. And then we mentioned about the 600 buffer. And in the last conversations we had, we talked about the zoning and, you know, where buffers can be. And I think that'll be a more depth conversation when we actually can have the maps of more specifically to Novato, showing where all that really sits and resides. And then that could be a specific discussion that we'll have associated with that for the sensitive buffer areas, including the daycare centers. So one of the research that comes out with this is, again, we talk about clustering and buffer zones, and research on alcohol and tobacco shows that as you create those safe zones and where things can be, you can see just by pulling the map off Weed Maps, where you can see like in Vallejo, where there's a cluster of businesses throughout the town, even though it's a little bigger town and it's spread out in there, but there is areas that you know, youth may frequent more. And so how do you make sure that strategically where you minimize where they're at, how close they're together, so that you don't end up in a situation that that we're going to talk about what Denver ended up with, and then it was too late for them to correct the thing. And so youth centers, again, is the area that we had mentioned, that how you define that. It's going to clear where, you know, baseball parks and youth soccer fields are is going to be clear, but when you have private private gyms or private volleyball clubs or swim teams or things of that, or a dentist office that focuses only on youth, changes kind of the situation related to that. So as we mentioned about the density, I show this map, not that this is going to be the numbers, but you know, when Colorado first allowed when this became legal in Colorado, this is a map of Denver. And there is over 1,000 dispensaries and retailers in Colorado, and almost 40% of them are in the city of Denver. And you know, they keep joking about there are more dispensaries in Denver than there are Starbucks. And so part of that is because they didn't have a control on their land use and address some of the issues until it was already too late to address that. So part of the concern, again, as we talk about the access to youth, is how do we keep the separation and the numbers so that it's not creating a green belt. And this is not only the retail side, but also on the wholesale, the manufacturers and the cultivations and the other types of activities. So that'll be critical, is how the design or consideration of businesses that may be exposed to where you don't want them to create clusters associated with this, to have an impact, again, not only to the youth, but also to other businesses, or where there's a benefit for being close together, there's also some disadvantages associated with that. So we mentioned this last time, but again, part of the land use component of this is what will be considered the buffer zones, and the buffer zone is from parcel to parcel. It's not from door to door. So as you see concerns regarding, at this point, of looking at it going forward, is that that's going to be strategically evaluated and make sure that now that we've got clear defined requirements from state law, that those are adhered to address some of the public safety concerns. So how do we help look at an industry that you potentially want to embrace in town? Well, some of the positives, as we've shared with you, is by regulating it, you can get not only good practices, but also making sure that it's done right. We look at a lot of businesses throughout the state, and there's some incredibly good businesses throughout the state that think they've got everything under control and they're in compliance with everything, and they're very passionate about making sure that they're meeting regulations because that's their best practice. It's not necessarily that they're following all the requirements of state law. So one of the parts of that is not only monitoring good practices, but also making sure that that adheres to the state law. As we mentioned last time, with the new regulations that are just coming out, There keeps to be a constant change on that, so we need that to stabilize so that there is some good practices to make sure public safety is there. And then we mentioned about the backgrounds, about the concerns of the community, wanting to make sure that who's working in these things, that there's good accountability for that. So we talked about the time, place, and manner issues. We talked about the staff time for the city to making sure that they can regulate this. And why does this become important? We keep having a lot of conversation associated with what we don't want, right? And so knowing what we don't want is how do you address getting rid of what you don't want? So by having good practices and good businesses in town, what you're doing is you're giving the consumer options. And as long as you have options to go somewhere, just like you go to a restaurant, you don't like the service you go, what do? You just go to another restaurant and you don't patronize that at. If you go to a market and you don't like what they provide to you, or you need more selection, you go somewhere else. Well, if you're a consumer of this product and the only option you have is to go to the black market or go to unregulated businesses or businesses that aren't in the up, then you need an option. And so this provides that option and eliminates some of the concerns that you have about encouraging black market and or where it's going to get exposure or eliminate the access to the youth in your community. So with that said, it goes without saying that where the public safety things come in to do, get rid of the things that you don't want and focus on the things that you do want. All these things that are up here on these two PowerPoints of concern are things that can be addressed as you move forward and normalize an industry in your community and embrace it to the degree where you think it's going to address your 4 core values, should that be the direction that you go in the future. So part of the land use that we share with this and is sort of the first step that Michael had mentioned about is the personal use component of this. So even though you have a legal right under Prop 64 to have a personal use and consumption, it doesn't mean that you can't be responsible in making sure you're doing everything to not only ensure safety for the people in your household, safety for the property that you may live in, but also for your neighbors and your community by following regulations and rules that are going to be put into place to address the limitations on how much you can have, how much you can consume in your own property, and more importantly is how do you do these things to make sure that youth are not accessed or exposed to them, even when we're talking not only your teenagers or teenage kids, but also little kids that don't know what they're getting exposed to by growing and personally and being exposed to pesticides and chemicals or water or heat lamps or things of that nature that needs to be looked at and very seriously thought out through and take personal responsibility. We're also seeing some cities creating social responsibility ordinances to address some of the personal elements of this. So where you think that, hey, I can do whatever I want in my own home, there is some personal responsibility of social responsibility to make sure that your teenagers or youth are not getting exposed to things or you're not doing things that are not being responsible as adults, just as you would for alcohol related to that. So the last section we want to talk about is something that has brought up a couple of times in your conversations and questions being asked at some of the other discussions that we've had, and that is fees, taxes, and revenues. So just like any process for the city does when they have a program, is that they create fees for things. And so looking at what kind of process the council may direct staff to pursue or develop, in any case, in any level of it, there's going to be fees associated with that to make sure that the city is made whole in processing those applications, just like you would if you're a business getting a conditional use permit or any other type of permits, or even getting a health permit or a building permit. You're going to have fees associated with those things. So this is no different than that. It's just a matter of what type of activities and roles people play in that process. And then down the road, should there be an industry here, then how do you overmanage them on the bigger picture because you'll create those annual regulatory fees that will come into place to make sure you have proper oversight of that. But the big components of this, I think, once you get them up and running is, okay, we let the industry in our town, they're here, what do we get from it from a community? What benefits do we get that can address other concerns and need, just like we would expect that from other businesses to say, hey, we want to come into your town too, be it big box or little boutique businesses in your community. They all, at a certain degree, pay some kind of taxes or create some kind of revenue to derive some benefit to the city as a good corporate citizen. So with that said, we look at taxes. And taxes sometimes are, are looked at confusingly from the voters as, well, am I taxing something that's going to be taxing me? Right? When you look at property tax improvements on a parcel, that's a tax on you as a property owner that is impacted by that. But the taxes that aren't affected to you are business taxes, TOT taxes, which has to do with, you know, people that stay in the hotels in town. But sometimes the myth of that, people are confused and say, well, I don't want to approve a tax because why should I want to approve a tax that's going to be a tax on me? This is not a tax on the community. It is not a tax on the consumer. It is a tax on the business for doing the privilege of being here and providing revenue to you to provide services that you derive the benefits from that. So when looking at taxes, a lot of articles and stuff you will hear about is we're being overtaxed. This is an industry that's being overtaxed. You know, they're complaining about it. What are the concerns about that? Well, we have transformed into a different place because of these taxes, and that has to do with because of Prop 64. Up to 6 months ago, businesses were only paying maybe a 5%, as high as 10% in taxes to local jurisdictions, but all of a sudden Prop 64 goes into effect, and now they've got an additional 25% taxes thrown on them. And so that now all of a sudden starts building up. Where we've seen in the states that come before us, Washington, Nevada, and Colorado, they're from 32 to as high as 45% in taxes, and those people felt the impacts of that as a result of that. And so here comes the little local municipality saying, hey, we want to have a tax on it because, you know, you want to be in our town, and all of a sudden they're getting beat up over it because they're last in the door to create a tax because of the Prop 64. So the goal would be to have a tax high enough to generate proceeds to offset costs or other some kind of derived benefits to you as a community, but at the same time low enough to avoid overtaxing the businesses and ensuring sustainability. Because you can tax them as much as high as you want, but that doesn't mean they're going to be around in a year or two from now. If the goal is to embrace them and have them here, then the goal is to figure out how to keep them here and make sure that they don't fail. Statistically speaking, there is going to be from a 40 to 70% failure rate in this industry. Colorado saw that, where it started off with 3,500 businesses, it went down to 50. Statistically speaking, there could be as high as a 40 to 70% failure rate in these businesses. And tax in all businesses. So what's the factor of that? Well, part of it is because they're transitioning into a rogue type business or a gray market which wasn't being taxed, not being regulated, not required to improve infrastructures of their buildings, and in being in a regulated environment and tax, all of a sudden it hits them, you know, all at once because it changes and transforms a lot of things that they're required to do. Remember, now that they're being responsible businesses, they have to pay, you know, unemployment tax, they have to pay health insurance, they have to pay other insurances, vacation and sick leave and all those other things in order to keep employees and keep them happy and make sure that they don't have a turnover. And so all those things start coming to a factor on that comes in sort of looking and addressing that. So the ability to, and then the other thing is as more and more cities are starting to do this, you saw where San Rafael just started looking at this, and there's going to be other communities around you that are going to be looking at this. So you're going to start competing with neighboring jurisdictions on certain things. So you need to be able to be competitive on taxes or fees or that overall burden impact to them in order to sustain them or encourage good businesses to want to come to you. Because there will be that problem on that. And then we had talked earlier, and one of the things that we highly recommend, and when we started looking at taxes 3 years ago, is to kind of have a freeze on taxes, either a freeze, the rates don't go up, or maybe even reducing rates as this continues to evolve and the industry starts maturing, but also gets impacted by new things that come into effect. And we constantly have changing in rules that kind of reshift the game a little. So, well, that's still a moving target. The goal would be to make sure that you're not throwing another wrench out there to impact them. But at the same time, because there are so many changes, you as a community, you know, as we saw technology change things, rules have changed. We're no longer a brick and mortar world anymore, but this industry continues to evolve in a technology world of efficiency rates and even how they do business. Is that you want to make sure whatever ordinances that may come back down the road, should you know, we move on past the regulatory side and have a discussion in a year, that you have things in place that are going to have flexibility for the council and for staff to look at being able to increase rates, decrease rates, look at inflation factors and things, looking at minimum and maximum rates, so there's movement as there is reasonable movement to look at things. And then have different rates for different parts of the industry. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we show you some of the things that do that. But why that becomes important, as we kind of mentioned a little bit, is everything you see on this slide has to do with what came in the last 6 months. This is what hit the industry, folks, from different touching points. The retailer business has to collect the excise tax from all the businesses at the end point. That's that 15%. The cultivators are now hitting with a excise tax for cultivation, as you see there, of 9.25 for the flower and the 275 for leaves. And then we have this new business that was created that wasn't in the old factor, and even the states that have come before us, is a distribution. Now they have to go through a third party just to move a product that's not doing it for free. And there's not that many of them out there right now, so they're charging as high as 30% just to move a product from city to city or from one business to the other. So that's another overhead that's starting to factor them until they can stabilize. And in some cases now, at least again, we talk about changing the factors. When we started this discussion a year and a half ago with new regulations, businesses weren't allowed to be part of the distribution change. Now it's changing where a business now can also include a distribution license. So as they figure and evolve what that is, I think that'll shift a little bit about the rates of distribution, but it still impacts them because now they have a fee if they even want to be their own distributor for a license. And then again, now we have the impact of the state created permit fees, that some of them are as high as $140,000 for some of these businesses annually.
Isn't the state tax? I thought it was 25.
Again, if you combination all this, it's equivalent of 25. Yes, this is the combination which we'll share in there. But if you calculate that out, and then we mentioned to you about the potentially a local regulatory fee that can be bouncing in there too, that can do that. So all these things kind of build up to why the industry gets a little frustrated about taxes and fees and how it impacts us, the little guy involved with that. So this kind of a little bit of visual illustration of that. On the top left, you see the retail tax of the excise tax. The bottom, you see that's on the Prop 64 side. Then you move it towards the consumer, just like any other product, you have the sales tax that's attached to it on like any other product that you buy. This is a taxable product that is out there. Now earlier, we've had someone bring this up in the past, so I want to share with this is that in Prop 64, it says that medical is exempt from the sales tax. Well, that is true in the law, but not factually all the way across. And the reason why is that what it says is that if you have an H&S 11362.71 card from the county, then you're exempt from that tax. Currently, there probably are less than 400 people throughout the county that even have that card, and it's starting to be more and more and less that people are getting that. And you say, well, why would that be the case? Well, first of all, the county's going to charge you $100 to get the card, and then you still have to get a doctor's recommendation, which can charge, be from $35 to $60 depending on where you go. And so now you're at $160, and if you do the math, you've got to buy almost $1,600 to $1,800, or as high as $2,000, depending on what level of product you get, just to break even to get the benefit of the tax. So most people are just going and paying the extra couple of dollars on the adult use side and not having to deal with that, even if they're using it for medical purposes.
Excuse me, I hate to be the one to keep on interrupting, but I was told that we could interrupt you.
We're going to have questions of it specifically on the slide, fine, but if there's questions in big, we're going to do that afterwards. So I just point that out to this because there is that misnomer about the exemption from the tax on the medical side. But there is no exemption. As you see on the top right, we've got some taxes that we're going to talk about some details on, but the city tax is not exempt from any, either the medical side or the adult use, should the city wish to pursue it in that direction. And then we've already, I think, touched enough on the cost recovery fees on the bottom right on there, but you can kind of see it in a frame of one area. So then the question is that, how does this industry get taxed? And what is a reasonable tax? And what does it look like from various components? And why do cities do certain taxes for certain types of activities? Well, there is a couple ones. The first one is a cultivation tax. Cultivation is taxed one of two ways, but majority of them, almost probably 85% of them, are taxed on what we call a canopy space, on a square footage component of it. And you ask maybe, well, why would you want to look at it from that perspective? Well, in the earlier days, when this was truly, and it still is for the most degree, is a cash business, and you're a wholesaler, you're going, well, how do I manage and monitor someone that's a wholesale business dealing with cash and trying to figure out how much we're going to get from them and how truly they're going to pay for that? The next question is, well, do we want to sit there and manage every little move they make as a grower from a taxing side, let alone the regulatory side? And so when you look at it from a square footage component, there are calculations that can be looked at in order to come to the same conclusion without having to be so critical or having that kind of oversight to them. And then secondly, cities, as you know, do either budgets annually or semi-annually, and they're trying to figure out what their budgets are and where they're getting their revenues from. And so when you have a big flux of what gross receipts can be, or trying to budget or forecast for that, a square footage gives them the ability to know a known number, because they'll know what that square footage component would be associated with that. Now on the opposite end, there says, well, you're taxing us on a square footage, but what happens if my crop dies or gets failed or contaminated? What happens if the building burns down, and you're telling me I still have to pay on the square footage, but I've got no product that's sold, that you're still asking me for a tax? Well, those were good arguments, and those are things that were being addressed. So when we recommend ordinances in today's environment, we actually have disaster reliefs built into those things, and waivers associated with that stuff, because that's the reality that in a cultivation world, that there is a contamination of product. You can get a hot day, and all of a sudden the heat comes on, and they don't have any air conditions or humidifiers going or anything that. All of a sudden 4 hours, and they just got this destroyed crop. So there's multiple things, and on outdoor grows or even mixed-use like grows, you've seen all the fires that are occurring that have damaged a lot of crops that pretty much put some people out of business. So on the other side, for other businesses, and again, you could have a gross receipt for the cultivation side, but typically the other businesses are based on a gross receipt tax, and part of that is that you don't know how successful a business is going to be based on their square footage. We have seen a manufacturing facilities of 800 square feet generate $4 million, and we've seen manufacturers that have 5,000 square feet and generate $1.5 million. So it's really about what kind of production they have. Do they have multiple shifts on their production? What kind of business models they are? What kind of branding they do? A lot of that can shift on how revenues are made, and so it doesn't really have a consistency on the size of the facility, although there is some correlation to it, but it's not consistently addressing that, and gross receipts is more to what they're available could produce. So the last slide, this kind of ties it all up and into how it looks and why sometimes you ask, well, then if we're taxing all of them, how do we keep it to a sustainable number on here? And I think you have it on your thing. It's a little tighter to see on here. I can't magnify this, but if you have the printout, really at the end of this line, and I'll walk through it so you can visually see it for all of us that wear glasses and that it's a little small. The goal is to keep it under 30%. And you say, why 30%? Well, again, remember all the states I told you that came before us? They started massaging their numbers, reducing their rates, and then they saw that as they got it under 30% from all the different levels of taxes, the volume of sales went up, but also the revenue went up because they found that point where people started not going into the, continue buying from the black market. Businesses were able to be a little more competitive. The prices seemed to more stabilize because then people had to compete for various prices. But then the local taxes and the sales taxes started shifting and let them to be a little more sustainable and not covering these ebbs and flows. And so, again, remember what I mentioned, we are now at a 25% state level that got all of a sudden hit this wall for all the businesses 6 months ago, and they're struggling. And as we've talked to businesses and went and audited them and looking at their books, and as we monitor, because we have all the data for every retail cannabis business in California, we monitor it from county to county, from city to city, and you can see it from year in from last year to where we are this year of how some of those have been impacted as a result of people going to the black market because all of a sudden they're paying this tax, this huge tax that's included in there that they didn't have before. So what this chart shows reflectively is the top level. What we've done is we've taken a price per pound and put it at the top. So when we looked at tax measures and developed them back in 2016, the price per pound was $2,000 a pound for an indoor, fairly mid-grade flower. Today, that same product ranges from $1,350 to $1,500 a pound. When we get into moving, and again, we're not really in a regulated complete world yet because we have very limited number of businesses that are up and running through this whole process, and it's going to take about 18 months before it really stabilizes and they get to that mature. And of course, with the new regulations come out, you're going to be looking at a product that's going to be about $1,000 a pound. And then it's going to get, and probably we're projecting based on some of the models and the evaluations that we've done of people we've interviewed of how they're doing their business models, we're going to be looking at $700 to $800 a pound in 3 years from now. So why is that critical? Well, if you're taxing businesses at high rates and their margins are becoming lower and lower profitability, and where we saw their margins of profitability being at 35, 40% prior to 2016, and they were just going crazy because they don't have all of these burden costs associated with them, we're starting to see those margins be 15 to 20%, and you're going to see them down to 10 to 12%. So all those people that were not worrying about, being inefficient and using a lot of water and a lot of electricity and what they were paying for stuff and what they were paying employees, and now having to pay all these taxes and regulations and do infrastructure changes, they're starting to seriously look at, oh my God, I'm starting to see this really hit me. And that's why I mentioned about the 40 to 70% failure rate. It has to do with those that are recognizing that, and what business didn't have to deal with those all of a sudden get that, they hit this wall that they're no longer profitable and they start collapsing and no longer can be in business. Because what we've also got to remember is we had a lot of illegal or rogue businesses that weren't regulated that were selling to dispensaries that didn't have to do anything to make sure they were part of their co-op and collective. To all of a sudden January 1st, they said, guess what? You can't do business with them anymore as a retailer, and the retailers had to change who they develop relationships with. So that's where you see that structure of a lot of businesses collapsing, but also the development of new businesses that are coming into the light and are going through those growing pains that are going to do that for the next couple of years. So with that said, every level of business is going to have a different ability and capability to pay a tax. When we talk about the cultivators, today there's almost 4,000 cultivators that produce almost 5 times more product than the consumer demand is in California. Consumer demand is 2.5 million pounds. There is almost 6 million pounds being produced in California. That's why the price is going to crash. But that's why some of those businesses are going to struggle, and why a tax and the burden on a cultivator needs to be evaluated differently. The next step in that, as we talked about, is the manufacturer. Manufacturing is going to be about 50% of that production product moving forward, because that seems to be what people are looking at. The states that come before that have slowly matured, where the flower was the dominant 60–70%. We're seeing that to come down, where the manufacturing is high as in Colorado at 60% of production. So they have a new avenue of opportunities for production and product, but then they're going to see a saturation about half of that of the cultivator. So the next one that's going to be hit that, because the retailers are going to have more options to lowball prices and making sure that what they're getting is a good product and a good quality, but who they built relationships with. Then, as we mentioned, everyone's got to move this product through a distributor. Well, in our opinion, a distributor, just like a testing lab, are just those necessary evil choking points. They don't touch the plant. They are the ones that, as a distributor, has to collect the tax, transport the product, and make sure that it's tested. That's their job and role. So they have to, now everyone, the cultivator and manufacturers, are forced to go through them in order to move their product to a retail. So that's an essential need. But what we're seeing is, as a choke point, there's not enough distributors even move the product up, and people are concerned that we don't have enough legal product to move through the chain. And same with the testing elements. In some jurisdictions, we recommend that where the rates are almost very low. I mean, we're talking 1%, 2% at the most. In big agriculture communities where they do a lot of agriculture entity, some are even not even in testing, requiring testing labs to pay a tax, or it's, again, that 1%. But for a city, they say, well, then why would they want to tax a business that may be coming to the city? Well, one of it is that if they're giving up a retail location, which is deriving benefits from a facility, even if it's a professional building where you got doctors or lawyers or CPAs or engineers using, that's businesses that were producing revenue that's now being taken away from them in order to have someone be here for free where there's low inventory of property. So that's something to keep in consideration in the chain. The last point is the one that ends up getting hit with everything, but also goes to the end user component of it, and that is the 15% excise tax, which is part of that 25% in the chain. And then if you add a local cannabis tax, which ranges somewhere between the pain point of an acceptable range for that is somewhere between 4 and 6%. But you'll see cities that are at 7, 8, 9, 10% because there were earlier movers of that, and their businesses are struggling with those rates because they can't bring their prices down to compete with surrounding jurisdictions, as we mentioned early in the conversation. So then starting them to be successful becomes critical that, because remember again at the end we talked about the consumer is going to be stuck with that 8 to 9% tax on top of that. So when you do the math on all this and build it up over that, it gets to about 30%. So when you start playing those figures around, or you have two rates through the whole vertical chain, you start seeing a collapse on what that does. So I think it's important for you as a community to recognize it's that this, bringing an industry into town is not going to solve all your problems. They're going to do their fair share of contribution and taxes, but it's not going to save the world and provide you. And they're not making millions of dollars. There's people out there in agencies, government agencies that think that this industry is just loaded with money and just spending money and have a whole lot to be out there. I think they can do very well and be successful, but don't think that based on what you're hearing is that they're basically got pots of gold sitting in there just ready to throw it away like there's no tomorrow. So with that said, we are done with this, and before we move on to the panels, I'll be more than happy to answer questions specifically to this presentation or comments or concerns regarding what I may have said or need some clarification on that. So at this time, I'll be more than happy to answer that, but are we bringing them up to the front for this too? So I think Michael's going to instruct you how we're going to approach this.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. If we're going to turn the podium around so that you can come up to the front and make your comments. And if I could have the panel members who RSVP, please go ahead and come sit up front. And if you have a question, you can ask it from the front as well. Also, just so you know, as we go through the process, if some of your questions don't get answered, or if you have additional questions you think of later, please feel free to go onto our website and email any questions to us. We will have an FAQ on the website that will address any questions that were unanswered at the workshops or that came subsequently. Thank you.
That question was asked, you have to fill out card. No, we're just gonna have people come up to the podium so that we can do it, formally on asking the questions. So, Susie, are you ready? Yeah. Okay, so if you want to come up, maybe one or two at a time, and then as you see someone sit down, feel free to come up. We're going to do the panel in a minute. We're just answering questions for my presentation first. We were just transitioning a minute here, but we will do that. Thank you. So, yeah. So again, we're just going to address questions regarding my presentation, and then we'll turn it over to the panel in a minute. So,
great. Thank you very much. I just to kind of round out the tax situation. I've got two colleagues who are on the panel, but we run a dispensary up in Sebastopol, and there's a federal tax regime which we didn't talk about here because it's not necessarily, which is not necessarily as relevant as the local tax in this context. But just so you guys who aren't aware, the federal government has this IRS code called 280E, which lets cannabis. Oh, thank you. Which has cannabis businesses, unfortunately, unable to deduct normal business expenses from their tax returns. For example, the only thing that a dispensary can deduct is cost of goods. We can't deduct labor or advertising or marketing costs from our gross income. And I'm not saying that to complain. I'm just telling you that it's just a fact of life that we're dealing with. And I read a recent article which said that part of the reason the government might be willing to kind of keep it scheduled as a Schedule I drug like heroin is that the tax regime is very beneficial to the IRS because they get more money from a cannabis business than from a regular business. I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. Thank you. So, so the 280 rules you mentioned is they are paying as high as a 75% tax on federal returns. Because of that, as you mentioned, you can't write off your lease agreement, employment, a majority of your expenses, and how it works is that they call it cost of goods. So anything, it's kind of part of the Al Capone rule or the cartel where everything you do up to the production of that product has potential for write-offs. So manufacturers, cultivators have opportunities for that. But as soon as it becomes sold into the retail side of a sold item, it no longer is the cost of production, it's actually selling an illegal product, which is why the retailers get hit the hardest for that. But the other side is too, they just have different ways to creatively to do that. But why they have to be creative to create shell games in order to write stuff off like any other businesses. And so that's been a big issue that they've had to overcome. And you get two different stories depending on what IRS agent you get and how that's being done. And I had to deal with that with Harborside and some of the issues of penalties for millions of dollars that they have with the IRS. So it was very interesting. And if you come up, please.
Excuse me. My name is Catherine, and I live in Novato, 11 years. And I once was on opiates, and through my doctors, I am completely off opiates now for over a year. And I rely totally on CBD for pain control. And has it ever been given some thought that people who are on medical cannabis have a lower tax rate because of, well, I spend $400 to $500 a month on CBD products. And that's without the tax. So if I buy something for $120, I'm spending $156 on my product. And that is a lot of money. And that's maybe for 2 weeks, and that's just 2 tinctures. Okay? So I want to know if there's just a waiver of sorts for medical cannabis users that has existed in the past in other states, or that could exist in Nevada. Thank you.
And you bring up a good point on that. I think we have council members here, so we talk about taxes, and I think as we transform, depending what decision they make of moving forward with something, or medical versus adult use, we have seen some cities where they've had a lower reduction rate for medical for concerns with individuals like you, so that they're not being burdened by that. We've also seen it where part of the decision process of businesses that come into that is what kind of community benefits do they provide for people that have medical needs. Businesses will talk about rewards programs and other incentives, so I'll leave that to them. But sometimes there are decisions made on the business models as part of how they can help people that have serious ailments, and how they can, either get free medicine or reduction medicine and things of that nature. And I'm for sure all these folks can touch on that, so I'm going to leave it at that for now. But from what we have seen from a taxing component, that's part of the discussion or strategies that can be brought back up when we get that part on it, if we get to that point. Okay? Who want to come up to the podium? Yeah, if you want to speak, come up to the podium because we're trying to.
Hi, I'm Berta Campos Anicetti, and I'm the Director of Latino Services at North Marine Community Services. My organization used to be the Novato Youth Center and Novato Human Needs Center, and we merged recently this year. I wanted to make a comment about the stats that you presented in the slide about youth use. Marine actually is very unique in terms of our numbers. We are higher than the average U.S. numbers that you presented. In Marin County, we have 30% use for youth of marijuana. This was back in data that we have from the California Healthy Kids Survey of the 2015-2016. And our percentages have been going up, and they're expected to be even higher. We're about to get new data in about a few months, and these are surveys that are done at the state level. So just encouraging you to look at our local data, because it's much higher than the US average. The other comment I wanted to make is that in the concerns for youth, also there was no mentioning of the evidence that we have, substantial evidence of cannabis use association with the development of schizophrenia and other psychosis effects. That was also not in the slides. And that's associated with high risk people, mostly with people who use a lot of cannabis with high use. And that's, we have a lot of very good data with that. This information that I'm giving you was given by Dr. Matt Willis, the Marion County Public Health Officer, back in November, when he gave a presentation about youth use and concerns about cannabis legalization. And the last thing I wanted to say is that in terms of billboards and all of that stuff, again, Marine is very unique. We don't have a lot of billboards here. And although, just like alcohol, our access to youth here in Marin and in Novato, with the data that we have, is mostly the youth access comes from home. It comes from older brothers, sisters, friends. It doesn't come from fake IDs. It doesn't come for kids coming to try to buy stuff from the dispensaries in this case, but from alcohol. So we see a very common parallel here with what happens with youth use and alcohol. It's very well regulated, and our police department does a great job with the states and all of that stuff. But the reality is that the access for youth is not mostly from the legal businesses. It's actually at home, and it's with friends, and it's people who actually are authorized to buy that gives the youth the access informally. So just food for thought.
Appreciate that. So, we talk about the disorders a little bit. I just kind of talked in the big frame of things, not going into a lot of detail, both for the youth and for adults in there, that there needs to be some kind of part of the goals and objectives and looking at that as responsible. You mentioned the Marin being higher, and of course the statistics I use were the states that have had legalization as a whole that come before us was in that 20%. So what's interesting about that stats is we've only been legal for 6 months, and yet the stats you have go on for a period show that that's the concerns of the black market, and why there needs to be a transition of that. And then, if you recall, I made a comment about social responsibility, adult social responsibility, because it's the adult that leaves their product on the nightstand, leaves it in their purse, leaves it on the counter, where we work with communities where creating a social responsibility ordinance where it's not only that, it's, you go away for the weekend and your kids have a party and they're drinking, that's a social responsibility. How do you have accountable, but also how are you educating them becomes very important, because that is the illegal activity. It's not the industry creating problems. It's how do good responsibility at all levels, and what does that mean, both from government doing a certain role, but also us as parents and adults doing that. And I'm going to let them talk a little bit, touch upon about what they do is when they do exit packaging, as far as literature, educating veterinarians, advising people, do's and don'ts of what they give to their patients or consumers that's going out the door, being social or responsible. So I'll let them expand a little bit on that as well. Please.
Hi, my name is Lynette Shaw. I own the Maryland Alliance for Medical Marijuana, and I have a direct correlation between the closure of the Maryland Alliance from 2012 to 2017, when there was zero access to medical here in Marin County. The patients were devastated, and they had to go to the youth to find their marijuana. We just reopened in 2017, and I think there's going to be a dip in this, because when you take a regulated licensed dispensary, it takes it off the streets. For 4 years, there was no regulated licensed dispensary in Marin County anywhere, and it went all to the streets, and of course the use went up, but I think you'll see a spike back down since we reopened in 2017.
Thank you, Lynette.
Hello, my name is George Bianchini, 62-year Marin County resident. I'm also in the cannabis industry. We just received 2 of the San Rafael licenses. I wanted to speak, being present at yesterday's Fairfax workshop for cannabis, to bring up one point. I was in business there as Broadway Video for 27 years. When Lynette wanted to first open her shop, she came to us. We were there first for support. I was kind of leery about doing it because I thought everybody's going to think the sky's going to fall. How can you back that woman? We did. During the 20 years, even though she was closed down for several years, but during her 20 years, and I've got this backed up by the Chief Moore, Chief of Police there, during that time, 2 grocery stores were robbed. The liquor store was robbed twice. The library had a break-in 2 different times. The youth center got burned. My video store had police calls that resulted in 4 arrests. The bars have a nightly visit by the police departments. But the cannabis dispensary in 20 years never had 1 police call. So for safety, and I've said this before at other meetings, we need to shut everything else down and just have cannabis dispensaries. But the point is that a lot of people think that they're nervous, completely understand that, but the fact that a well-regulated market is much better for society, as Lynette had said, once you have free access or fair access, people, adults, legal people to use the product have somewhere to go. Even in Fairfax, they're medical only, which means that about 70% to 80% of the folks there still need to get on the phone and call their man Friday to come and deliver them some marijuana. A lot of those people have been doing it for a long time. And there are some that are maybe okay, it's still the black market, but there are some that have other things in different pockets and maybe a gun in the back, and they enforce their business the way the underground black market works. So having a regulated market is far safer and has less accessibility for children. So if folks want less access to children, they should consider regulating the market. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think one of the points there, the comment made is in the earlier stage when there was only Lenitz facility, is that there's limited places to go and get it. And as we talk about it, as long as there's a consumer demand, it's always going to be there for the adult world. So how do we make sure we get less and less being in the black market? And I think one of our earlier presentations, we brought up a map from Wheat Maps where we said, show me every delivery can go into Novato, and there's 35 deliveries, right? Well, there's not 35 retailers in the region that can deliver, which means that's black market for the most part. But that means that there's a consumer demand for there. And so how do you address balance a consumer demand in your community or even in the region to balance that out? So some of the issues that are being concerned regarding the black market or illegal activity transforms into alternatives for people to go to, like the example I gave you for the grocery store or to the restaurant when you don't like the service or need an option to go to with that. So, any other questions related to this topic? Oh, question glasses there.
This may be something you covered in a previous meeting, but there's the survey, and I assume that the survey that we're picking up here is also the one that's online. And there are a lot of things that we're supposed to say how we feel about them that are based on the slide on our papers. It's page 5 about the zoning districts. And I just wonder, maybe there's more information online about them, but the areas seem a little gray to me. I don't know anything about zoning, but I don't understand, what neighborhood commercial is, as opposed to general commercial, as opposed to, now I can't see because I got my glasses. But I think it's going to be really hard for the average person. Maybe people who own businesses understand what these zoning districts are. But, for a relatively normal person like me, I think it's very confusing, because we're supposed to rank, 1 through 10, where, what kind of businesses we think is okay to be in these different zoning districts. And I feel like, how can I even think about it? Because I don't know what it means.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, we pointed out a little bit that one of the goals, I think, for one of the upcoming council meetings, we're going to have those GIS maps that are going to have more specific with the buffer zones around them, but it also have the keys that will be tied and color-coded associated with those zones, so it'll be clearly defined and you can visually see that. We were just trying to give you a bigger concept over that because it's going to be a whole discussion specifically to that. Once we have, again, typically the 600-foot buffer for schools, youth facilities, and daycares, it's going to say, here's where these are at, and here's the zones that those are at. And so let's have a conversation about our concern of where those are going to be and what those zones will be. And we'll make sure, I think we'll define those clearly on when we get to that. Any Michael, please.
And just to add, that information is available on the city's website. If you go to the Community Development Department, in our general plan, it has a really good map that shows where those areas are, as well as a description of those areas. But as David mentioned, we will, when we get back to council, have a little bit more of a descriptive narrative as to what neighborhood commercial means, what does general commercial mean, industrial, because those terms, aren't as common, if you're not in that field or area.
And if we've signed into these meetings, like come here and sign in, we'll be notified when that particular council meeting is?
Yes.
Oh, we will?
Yes. Anybody who sign in, provide notification for all community workshops or presentations to council on the cannabis program. Thank you.
And if you're not getting that, let Brian know so he can make sure you are getting it. Yes, sir.
Good evening. I'm sorry I didn't have a question. I just have a comment. or maybe an interjection, a suggestion. It was 1996 that the medical marijuana law was approved by, what was it, 74, 76% of the people? In that intervening 22 years, that's 7,900 some days, Novato has done absolutely nothing to facilitate or help the cannabis industry in any way whatsoever. Not medical, not any way. Between the federal government and the state of California and all of its taxes, my God, it's taxed every inch of the way. Have you noticed that? Of course you have. Grow, distribute, test, retail. Between those two entities, it's taxed quite enough. I urge Novato to abandon this search, to leave it alone entirely, and to pay as much attention to cannabis as you do to chocolate and balloons. Thank you. Remember, please, every penny of tax you add to it makes me closer to call my friend David instead of going to the dispensary.
Any comments?
Once again, Catherine McMuty, living in Novato, very happily. I just want to thank the HDL Corporation Company for helping Novato with this and teaching, going through these 3 meetings. Now, I understand that we will be now able to come to the city council meetings and not vote, but give our opinions on how we feel about certain subjects. I don't want to be left in the dark now, is what I'm saying.
That's a great question. So at the conclusion of this outreach process, we'll complete by the end of August. Staff will be presenting those findings, and that'll be the feedback from these workshops, as well as the online survey. And we'll be taking that information to the council to allow them to begin the deliberation process to see what is the feedback. What has the community said is desirable for them as it relates to cannabis activities. Do they want to see retail storefront shops? Do they want to see manufacturing, distribution? So we'll have that process sometime in September. And then in October, we'll start to look at, okay, then what does that look like? Is that now 2 or 3 retail shops? What types of businesses would be allowed in Novato? So you'll have a couple more opportunities to provide feedback to council before they make a vote or decision on what the final regulations will look like. And again, that information will be available on our website. If you signed up, you'll get an e-notification via email regarding that information as well.
Thank you very much.
I'm a nurse, and I've been working in hospice and palliative care for most of my career. Currently a palliative care nurse, and
You have to get right.
I'm a palliative care nurse, and I think one comment that you made about putting signage up saying that to call if there's anything wrong with his business should be in front of the liquor stores as opposed to the dispensaries. I take care of all those people with those serious illnesses from cirrhosis and so forth, so I just want to say that's a big cost to our whole society, and there isn't any evidence that marijuana is doing that. So that's just my comment. Thank you.
Sure. And I said there are some folks that have done that because, again, as an industry that's transitioning and trying to normalize and be accepted in the community, they want to let the community know that they're not trying to hide anything, that if you have a concern, that they want you to be approachable. And so that was something that they've done. It's not something the city's mandate that they do that. And you would be, yeah, you're right. Anything that's in that. Sure, I understand that. And that's, again, that's the industry that has created that, again, to that normalization. We talked about this morning in the business communities about, this is nowhere to hide them. It's to get them normalized and make people more comfortable that they're no different than other businesses. The more that you are educated and understand what they do, that it becomes just like any other business that's in town. So,
let's make sure we're not making it so different that it looks like something different.
Again, it's about that perception of making a community comfortable when it needs to do that, and everyone's in a different degree. So it looks like we're done with questions. We're going to transition into the panel. And so, do you want me to do the direction? So
Yeah.
I got one mic. I'm going to hand it over here. So we can start to the right. You have to share that mic. Introduce you, say your name and where you're from and what company. And we will transition to this side.
Good afternoon. My name is.
Could you move this up, please?
Hello. Good afternoon. My name is Bill Harriet. I represent Lipizome Formulations Incorporated. We are a licensed medical cannabis manufacturer and distributor here in Novato. We're a biopharmaceutical company located in the Belmarine Keys area. And we make pharmaceutical grade cannabis products. And I'm here to answer any questions anyone may have about our operations and the products we make and how we can be of service to the community.
You exist now?
Yes.
Could you say the name of your company one more time?
Yeah. Lipizome Formulations Incorporated, otherwise known as Lipomix. You can see us on the web at lipomix.com, and we're in the Belmarine Keys area.
Hi, I'm Eli Melrod. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Soulful. We're a licensed cannabis dispensary in the city of Sebastopol for both medicinal and adult use, with the mission of helping folks improve their health and happiness through the responsible use of cannabis.
Hi, my name is Tess Kofoid. I am the Senior Director of Communications, Marketing, and Branding with Soulful. I'm also a mom. I have a 9-year-old daughter, so this is a very important topic, and we're really feel touched to be a part of the conversation with everyone here.
Hello, my name is Maurice Solis, and I'm one of the co-founders for what will soon be formally known as Relief, and will pretty shortly be Plantasia, which is on my polo, and also one of the co-founders for Plantasia Innovative Research Labs.
My name is Tari Kalazre from San Francisco. We run Bay Area Safe Alternatives. We've been in business since 2003. I came to participate, I guess, and answer some questions with regard to the taxes and the cost of doing business. David McPherson did a fantastic job explaining all the stuff. There's also a lot of additional compliance costs that the cannabis business is having to deal with, and that would add about, in my opinion, 20%. So it's getting expensive.
Are you a retailer?
I'm both a retailer and a distributor, yes.
And what's the name of your company again?
Bay Area Safe Alternatives.
I'm sorry. Bay Area Safe Alternatives. Safe Alternatives. Very nice.
Thank you.
My name is Sarah Schrader. I'm a fibromyalgia patient and a mother of 2. I sit on the San Francisco State Legalization Task Force as well as the Sonoma County Cannabis Advisory Group. My work experience has been for the nonprofit Americans for Safe Access. I've been a legal assistant as well as founding Compassionate Health Options with Dr. Hanya Bart. I'm currently working with both retail and micro business facilities, which includes cultivation, distribution, manufacturing, and retail. And I was invited here with BASA today. I'm here. I help them with compliance.
Hi, good evening. My name is Chris Schulman. I'm the general manager of Grassroots, a medical and adult use dispensary in San Francisco that's been in business since 2005.
There's no deliveries up there. These are all dispensaries, correct?
We double up. We could do deliveries.
Do you do Sebastopol, you do deliveries or just a dispensary?
Just retail.
You have a set location?
Yeah, brick and mortar.
There we go. So I asked.
And are you Corey?
Excuse me?
Did you say, what's the name of your company?
Lipizome. Lipizome Formulations Incorporated.
Lipomix.com.
Yes.
And where's that located?
42 Digital Drive, Novato, California.
Oh, it's not retail.
That's not a retail. We're a biopharmaceutical company. We don't sell to the public.
Thank you very much.
intent here today with this panel is to try to get a mix of different types of cannabis industry folks here, manufacturing, you have some that do retail and do distribution. So it is to give the community the opportunity to ask questions, to get an idea of what it looks like, you know, what maybe some of the regulatory challenges are, you know, what they see as potential for Novato. So if you have questions, please come up to the podium.
So, if there's any questions, I'll ask them some questions to stimulate some of the questions that were brought. I think that would be critical. But if you do come up to the podium, and while he's coming up to the podium, if one of you can raise your hand, I brought up 2 issues. One was what were you doing on your packages going out the door of educating people of the do's and don'ts for responsibility. So does anyone want to touch upon that? How you're educating patients of being socially responsible?
Well, the city of San Francisco, there's a requirement that we put a piece of paper with every customer that buys it, educates them about the dosage, you know, the do's and don'ts of, or a lot of the do's of cannabis.
My name is Alan Markrack. I'm a 50-year resident of Marin County. I have 30 family members living here. My question was kind of more pertaining to a delivery company more than a set dispensary, but I think they might be able to answer my question. If a licensed delivery company in Sonoma County delivers to Marin County, say they deliver directly to Novato, the sales tax goes to what city? Novato, or does it go back to Sonoma County?
I'll answer that. I'm the tax man. Bradley-Bird's law says that the principal place of negotiation where that. So if they're in Sonoma County, the sales tax goes to the place of negotiated and executed. Just think about Domino's, right? We call Domino's, but they come to Novato, but they're your neighboring city. The tax goes to them for the sales tax. However, if the city had a business tax, any transactions they do in the city of Novato could be subject to the city tax, so that there would be derived some benefit from that.
So all the sales, if I'm correct then, that have been made in Novato have not come into Novato.
That's correct.
So it sounds like Novato needs to put an end to this immediately. Yeah, all right. Thank you. I just wanted to bring clarity to that.
Anyone else want to come up? While we're doing that, maybe Tess, you can talk about some of the, if you, since you have some of these parents, about what things can parents do, especially someone that's from the industry of educating youth from an adult or a parent perspective, and how you probably provide some of that information.
Of course, I think that, so I come out of the wine industry. I spent the last 10 years in wine marketing and tourism. I grew up in a household that was very cannabis friendly, and my parents didn't drink. And I remember growing up having a lot of other parents not want to let their children come to my house. Because God forbid, my parents, would smoke a joint and put on a Beatles record. And that was kind of how their night ended. And so I think what it really comes down to is being able to have the same conversations you would with your children about alcohol, or the same conversation you would have with your children about the prescription drugs that are in your medicine cabinet. I have had a talk with my daughter about cannabis. My father grows medicinal cannabis in his backyard. It's always been around, and it is my responsibility as a parent to, number one, have an open dialogue with her about everything in life. It's not just cannabis, it's about how you choose your friends, how you treat other people, alcohol. It's the same thing. It's all about raising children that we can teach them responsible consumption, but then also being a responsible parent and knowing that you keep it hidden. It's the same, again, it's the same as your alcohol. My daughter the other night, we were at my mom's house, and she comes running in, and she goes, "Oh my God, Mom, I think I drank some of Grandma's vodka." It was tequila, but she didn't know, but she picked up something that she thought was a glass of water, took a sip of it, spit it out immediately, and it freaked her out. She didn't like it at all. But it's the exact same thing with cannabis. And it's better now, because back in the day, there might be a brownie in someone's kitchen, but there wasn't a package on it. There wasn't a warning label on it. So any kid could go in thinking that they're going to eat a brownie. I have now told my daughter, if there is a leaf and an exclamation mark on the package, even though it's put away, if you get into it,
don't touch it. These are off limits. So I just think as parents and as a community, you just have to talk to your kids. And I mean, I know maybe that seems a little too straightforward, but I think that's really what it comes down to is it's your responsibility as a parent to teach your children. You know, if a high schooler comes home drunk, you don't call them or Lagunitas and get mad at them for producing beer. You would get mad at yourself, at least I would. I would get mad at myself for having left that accessible to my child. Or I would get mad at the parent who left their vodka out where a kid could grab it. You know, so again, it's simply about how you parent and just talking openly and, you know, teaching them. That's your responsibility as a parent.
Good, thank you. So the other comment that was brought up is for medical patients. What do they do for people that have limitations on, you know, being too expensive or very restrictive on how to do that? Someone have any programs that you provide that want to talk about it? Let's let her share first.
I was just going to touch on your comments. I agree with everything you say. In San Francisco Unified School District, what they're teaching people is not abstinence, but wait as long as you can, because the longer you wait, the longer your brain is developed. They're also teaching people that the difference between edibles and smoking is the same thing as the difference between tequila and beer. There's a much stronger effect when you're consuming it and your body is exposed to smoking it. In Colorado, there were a lot of people that were ending up in the hospital on overdoses of cannabis because they were using edibles as well. And what they developed was a very widespread campaign at every bus stop. For the very first time, try 5 milligrams. And the point there is so that people know what the dosage is. They start as low as dosage as possible so they don't end up over-consuming medicine and ending up in a place where they have a bad experience. When it comes to compassion, I've been a compassion patient for over 20 years. What that means is I've been relying on the generosity of other providers to be able to help me because I can't afford my daily supply of cannabis. Right now, we are still only exempt from 1 out of the 3 taxes when we are medical cannabis patients going to purchase at a facility. But cities and counties have the authorization to be able to create their own compassion policies. There's also a bill at the state introduced by Scott Wiener that would support compassion. And I agree with you that there's a lot of hypocrisy in requiring a state ID card because if you're a low-income patient, to require them to go to the doctor and go get this identification card is more steps than your average 21-year-old. So to require someone that's really sick to go through these extra steps is really, should be an unnecessary burden. And I'll let Tarek tell about his compassion program because he's been serving patients for a very long time.
Well, pretty much the patients have lost with the passing of Prop 64. And what we ended up having to do is, since we are a compassionate club and for many years, we began, I guess, eating that 15% excise tax for the patients and taking it out of our margins. We're hoping that business will increase and it will pay for itself. But yeah, I mean, it's a huge burden. It's getting more expensive. The people who started this stuff, you know, they're revolutionaries. They never rule. They always get tossed. Yeah, I mean, the hospices, we still, you know, the state does not give us any break on that. So all of this stuff comes out of our margins.
So what is another option for the city or a county if they don't want to go through the state ID process because that's so expensive? Can you repeat the question?
Hi, my name is Pat Ackland, and I'm on the city council. The question I have is that I understand that the state ID process is expensive and a lot of folks don't want to go through that process. What is an alternative for a city or a county to be able to verify that yes, this is a compassionate use? Is there another alternative? Should cities or counties issue cards at a lower price? I don't know if we can or not. What is an alternative for us if we want to implement something like that?
The price is based on participation per county. So what that means is your Department of Public Health state ID card price is based on how many people are participating. So the more people that come down and participate, the lower that cost is going to be. I think where the key is right now is to create some incentives for the facilities that are willing to go out of their way to be compassionate facilities. Tarek has a program where he has patients come once a week to come get the quantity of medicine they need, and if they have special needs, like they require edibles, then there's a package waiting for them once a week just with those products. If a facility is going to pay for the cost of the product and pay for the taxes on it, then we should make sure that we're alleviating that burden for them in another part of that financial chain.
Thanks.
And I mentioned a little bit about in the evaluation criteria of bringing businesses in, it's part of their business plan where if you said, okay, what kind of community benefit do you provide for patients in need? And how they describe that, you can put a weight in the scoring element or the evaluation if you're limiting the numbers that are coming in town based on their willingness, what kind of business models they have, and kind of historical, what they demonstrated that they're truly genuine have done that in the past as part of the mission and goals of the program. Any other questions that we have?
I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on the education that you do for patients. Because I don't know if the community knows how wonderful some of that education that you do is for the patients that come into your dispensaries. Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Education is really core to our mission, and so the first thing we did is that we had a lot of folks coming in who really didn't understand cannabis at all, but they had heard that it could help them sleep, or they were getting pain relief, and they had friends and family members who had these experiences. And so we actually put together these field guides. They kind of have like a cannabis primer in them that we distribute to all new customers or patients who come into our store, and that helps kind of give them a framework for how to think about the product. In addition, we host a lot of educational events in the evenings, ranging from women's health and cannabis. We've had events on, we hosted a local moms group about how to talk to your kids about cannabis and how to keep it away from them. And part of that is, I think, brick and mortar is really important, for at least it works really well at basketball because it allows us to have those spaces where we can get the community together and have these educational events. And so, that's what we think that brick and mortar really does facilitate that better than, say, a delivery-only model. When you have operators who want to do the work to create the educational events, and that's been really core to our mission. I think it allowed us to help a lot of people, and we have dozens and dozens of folks coming in every day who really are sleeping better at night and getting pain relief and all of that, and that has really started with kind of the education we do up front, and then also the training we do for our team. So that's a big component that before folks ever kind of make it on the sales floor, they go through kind of an extensive process that we developed working with local physicians and nurses and things like that to really put together kind of general dosing guidelines and ways that they can help respond to folks' questions and things like that, as well as going out. And so we've gone out to senior centers and done talks there, and even went out to Oakmont in Santa Rosa and brought people in vans and kind of showed them what a dispensary could be and all that kind of stuff, because there's a lot of fear. And so also inviting people in and having things like open houses and things like that has been really helpful so that folks can really get the most benefit out of it.
I think it's really important when you at a retail dispensary to have that patient or customer connection with the bud tender or customer service agent. They're much more than just a cashier or a retailer. They're asking questions. They're triaging the customer or patient to find out, what's their level of sophistication with cannabis. Have they consumed it before? How have they consumed it? What types of needs they have? Most of the adult use clientele still has a need. That they're not just coming in for the effects, for the fun of it. They have sleep issues. They have pain issues. They have other issues. So you really have to make that personal connection and ask the questions of the consumer to help connect them to the product, and then also really stress to them things like dosaging, stress to them the effects that the different types of cannabis can have listed in them. Do they not want to get a psychoactive effect, and connect them with the CBD product, etc. And then also I do think the literature that we hand out, although it's mandated, it is beneficial because it also reinforces when they go home, they can read that card that says, oh, what I was told in the dispensary, start with 5 milligrams or 10 milligrams. Oh, it's written down, it's official, it's something that we maybe need to take to heart. But it's really that personal connection and being more than just a cashier or a retailer, but being more of a consultant.
Could you, you said the word dosaging, and some people may not know what that means. So can you talk about what that means for someone that just doesn't?
So edibles are dispensed in milligrams, and the new state mandates that there's new packaging guidelines, but we really recommend that people start off at like 5 or 10 milligrams, even 5 milligrams, just the bare minimum. We even have products with 2.5 milligrams or less of cannabis, and so it's like you're looking at alcohol percentages, you're looking at things like that. You know, if you're having a 40 proof shot of a drink, you can have a number of different liquors that will get you the same effect. Just like that, we have a number of different products and they're all dosed out. And it's just very important to be mindful. We have folks that have been medical patients for years that require hundreds of milligrams in order to reach a level of comfort or whatever they're trying to get at. Whereas, a new customer, a new cannabis user might need 5 milligrams. And also people need to realize, and what you learn in the store and that patient interaction, is smoking is different than ingesting. I've got colleagues in my store that could smoke, an amazing amount of cannabis, yet they cannot even consume it edibly because it's just too much for them. Yeah. And then, so it's really important to educate the public about that.
So, counseling has always been a key component of my work with the Marin Alliance with the patients for over 20 years. And what I find confusing is that they're considering banning counseling as part of the services in retail. And I don't know why they're considering this at the state level, but this doesn't make any sense. Obviously, it's a very, very important part of what we do. And this is why I'm asking you, because you're working directly, obviously, with the state, is why would they consider banning counseling? That was they were floating this in the permanent rules.
That's a good question because a lot of you will have that service in there. I mean, obviously there's
essential
massage therapy, others. It's part of the healing part of it because of the education component of that. Why the state does that, I think it's more of how you have the limited access areas and how that is built out. And we haven't gotten into deep discussions about that, but that's something that I can look into, see how it's impacting those that are actually providing that, because I don't know why. I think it may be restricted of where areas it can be. So just to those that understand, there's what they call limited access areas. So if this blue line was one side of a reception area, well, once you cross that blue line and you're no man's land where you shouldn't be, then there's certain services that they don't want the patient to be there, or only employees can be. And so how they provide certain services like therapy, it could be holistic, it could be just counseling, it could be other services, where they don't want that in the limited access area, where that's kind of what the concern is how do you separate those functions on that. So I'd be more happy to look into that, so thanks for reminding me about that. You wanted to say, oh, she did? Okay. One thing I like to, because I know we're timing people how we want to do in the panel, is that I'd like the panel to give an example of a challenge that they've gone through being in the community that they're at, and how you as the community here, and also some of the policy and admin people, can take that lesson learned as they develop a program and learn from that process, or what challenge they've gone through to continue their growth process as a business. Tough question, huh?
Well, I guess our major challenge has been how to introduce our products into the marketplace as a pharmaceutical company. We're approaching the cannabis industry from a slightly different perspective than those who have been traditionally in the cannabis business. As a biopharmaceutical company, we have prescription drugs and FDA clinical trials, and cannabis is a minor aspect of our business. We intend to develop these products to pharmaceutical grade standards. We're audited twice a year. We follow federal regulations 21 CFR 111 and 211 for prescription drugs. And we manufacture these products to a pharmaceutical grade standard primarily marketed to medical professionals as a standardized method, and it's available in both an intravenous formulation for doctors and an oral gel formulation in standardized strengths, so that the doctors or medical professionals can then prescribe them or recommend them to their patients for specific medical conditions, rather than suggest a smokable product or a product of unknown origin or strength. We're primarily looking to standardize the dosage form and standardize the packaging and presentation, primarily for medical patients.
We have a question for you.
Yes, please.
And how are you educating physicians about this?
Sorry, Ken.
How are you educating physicians about this?
All right now we're just getting into that by showing them our product literature and packaging, and they've been very well received due to the consistency of our packaging and the universality of how they can sort of pick and choose which products to use. Right now we have 3 cannabis-based products, and it's just mainly the same way we educate doctors with drugs.
Great.
I think for us, overall, the biggest challenge has been the moving target of regulations at the state level. I think David spoke to this in some of his presentations a little bit tonight, that we've gone through several different iterations of what the state is requiring, from different types of licensing, different fee structures, all of this, which has been really difficult for us to be proactive and plan our business, and it's kind of forced us to be reactive, which is not a great feeling when, 1 week we're supposed to do this and we spend dozens and dozens of hours, changing the way we do things, and the next week that'll change back, or we'll call the state and get 2 different answers, and that's been really challenging. And then just the increased cost of doing business has been challenging. We want to focus on, doing education and growing our business, and we spend a lot of time reacting to things that we can't really anticipate.
Well, we were getting past notes up here as well, which I don't really have an answer.
You want me to say?
You want it? Is it, can we do
You
this?
don't mind?
Can we break the rules a little bit?
Well,
Because
it's,
he's got a good challenge that we brought up in
It's a
Sonoma
question,
County.
or is it?
No, I
You
just-
like our colleague, okay.
Yeah.
So,
You
I'll
just
just go
here.
yeah, so I was just gonna say, I was gonna scream, that I thought that we got sort of socked in the face when we were trying to open in October of 2017, because we were supposed to open about 5 days after the fires broke out. And so we had this whole plan, we were all staffed up and we were ready to go, we had all our inventory, and we were gonna have a grand opening, and we just felt like it really was not a cool time to be celebrating, our opening in the face of what the community was having to go through. So we huddled and we figured, well, we've got everybody here, what can we do to build a team, and part of our mission is being involved in our community. So we just did a couple things. We had our team go out and volunteer all around the county wherever there were issues. We became one of 4, I think, distribution centers for CannaCraft, because they had identified all these people, patients that were really heavily dependent on cannabis as a med. And so we were one of 4 that was a station where people could come and get free medication during that ordeal. So I think I was just very proud as a co-founder of this business that was our reaction to what was a really difficult start for any business. And I think it set the tone for the rest of the team in terms of our values, what we think is important, and we kind of just went for it. And I think it made the team feel great, and we weren't looking for publicity or anything like that. I'm not even sure we got any for that, but it didn't matter. It was a private
internal thing that really created the basis of our culture of being part of the community.
Yes, you might want to kind of move over since you already had your, oh, okay.
So I think for us, our biggest challenges, much like our friends over here from Sebastopol, has been the ever-changing finish lines. A lot of the local ordinances have been changing, at least for us, and I know a lot of other ones have also, and they've been doing so almost every single year for almost a decade now. And then you throw in the constant ever-changing climate and regulation with the state of California, it makes it really difficult to be able to know how to operate in a legal fashion. The other hardest part is the taxes. The taxation has become really nasty. I mean, just us, I don't know how it's happened for you guys. We've taken almost a 30% hit just in business. And now you also include adding all these taxes and everything, your profit margins. I mean, they're so bad that a lot of people in the industry are just walking away from it. I've heard rumors of suicide rates going up amongst the industry because people who, they build a life, family, they drive 2 cars, live in a house, just like most people do, all of a sudden lose all of those things due to taxation. Also the hardships that they're going through, I mean, it takes a really big toll on you, and you go through a lot of sleepless nights that you're just thinking of, what am I gonna do with my staff if I end up having to close? And those are really hard things to wanna try to bring up to, even to staff. We've had staff members that have quit just because it's way too difficult for them. And a couple of them have moved out of state because they just don't wanna be a part of, not only just the cannabis community, but they don't wanna be a part of this big California taxation wave that seems to go over every industry that ever sprouts that wants to do. Like for us, we're much like, I'm assuming you guys have been very compassionate with the communities where you work in. We've served the people, we serve over 20 different 501c3s. We donate free medicine to our patients just like most everybody does. And come 2018, when all regulations changed, everything that you were giving to patients before, like for us, anybody who's terminally ill, we give everything that they require as far as cannabis products. So we don't just give them a set type of goods, we give them exactly what it is that they require, and some of them have been almost $4,000 a month. We have to pay to give them free products. We have to pay 15% on top of giving them something for free. Plus now the timing also that your employees have been there helping them, maybe a delivery driver that went out to see them, and these are all costs that we're taking on. And it makes it really difficult to even want to operate in this type of business. I mean, honestly, if it wasn't for my wife, I would have quit years ago. I mean, it wasn't anything that I ever thought was going to turn out to be this difficult.
Goes back to that 40 to 70% failure rate I mentioned too. This is a living example of concerns that they have. Go ahead.
I'll give you an example of some of the costs that has changed. Last year I paid $16,000 in business liability insurance. This year, today actually, is the renewal of my policy. Now I'm supposed to have product liability and blah, blah, blah. $56,000 is my the bill. I have a retail and I do have a cultivation. I ended up today actually just paying half of just the liability one. So it's the expenses are this high. On top of insurance, we're supposed to get a surety bond. I don't know why. Instead of having one person at the door, you're supposed to have 2 people at the door, all days and all operation hours. That's on top of the fact that your landlord is going to want to charge you maybe 4 times the fair market value of the thing. So I have been in business 15 years. I think by 2019, or early 2019, quite a bit of people will actually go out of business only because, like me, like a lot of new things are happening. Like $56,000 for the insurance. I did not factor that in. The car, the 2 drivers in the car. So there'll be a lot of consolidation. A lot of people will go out of business really soon. Yeah, so just to, I suggest, the payroll, gross receipt tax is really high. In the cannabis industry, like when you talk about $4 million a year, and you want to charge like 10% gross domestic, of the gross receipts. What is that? It's like $400,000. I mean, it's yeah, it's getting funny. Thank you.
I could share a statistic from Sonoma County. At one point, they were predicting there was going to be at least 428 cultivation permits, and in May there were 5. So if we have 1.1% of our predicted permits going through, that means 99% of our jobs and our small companies are going out the door right now. And so that's a huge dramatic change for some of these mom and pops that have been in operation for a very long time. The biggest concern for me is the loss of the small companies that existed here in California. Well, what I'd like to see is a smooth transition for those companies, people that existed as providers, because they took a risk for us that no one else was willing to take a risk for it during those times. And I think that we should look at costs as being reasonable to help the smaller players. Things like having reasonable tax rates, things like having reasonable fees. I also think we should look at zoning. If we make it too limited, what will happen is the competition will come in and outbid each other, and only your players with larger financial backing will be able to get through. So my advice is to make this a threshold that your smaller players can participate, so we can have small business thrive just as well as the big business here in California.
I think I agree with my colleagues up here. Compliance is probably our #1 challenge right now. The goalposts change every couple months from the state. Like in San Francisco, they're interpreting things different than what we've been told by the BCC, and et cetera. So compliance is a big challenge. The fees, the taxes are obviously a challenge. But what's actually gotten better though is the perception of the community in terms of just the acceptance of cannabis. We found that we've donated for years to a local organization that supports a park in our neighborhood. And for years we've had to make donations to another nonprofit, and then that nonprofit would donate to this nonprofit because they didn't want cannabis attached to them. And just last month we made our first direct donation. So so there are a lot of challenges, but there have been some real changes over the last couple of years, I think, in terms of how we're perceived. And we really do want to be perceived as another business, a socially responsible business that's willing to be a good community member.
I just have one last thing. For somebody like us who's taken a 30% hit on the market on the amount of people that actually come to visit us, and I'm assuming most people have had somewhere around there, all of those people didn't all of a sudden stop consuming the product. All of those companies that didn't make it past January, that may have had $2-3 million in inventory, guess where it goes? It goes right to those patients. So the people who have been trying to operate legally to respect all the laws and pay all of their taxes are the ones that take the biggest hit, and the consumers just go elsewhere where the product is cheaper.
So you can see by some of their experiences that getting to normalization is not an easy task. And as they transition to that, they're far from done. We just got the new regs that came out less than a month ago, and again, they moved on us again. We're at the end of the 45-day hearing process for input for that, and then they're going to have to react again one more time to new regulations that will be coming on that will impact their businesses. So appreciate all the time that you guys have got here, and Mike wants to close. Before we do, is there any one last question that we just got to ask? No? Okay, thank you. And
thank you, David, and thank you again to our panel members. Again, as I mentioned earlier this evening, this is completion of our community workshops, where we will have some community presentations at the council level. So please stay engaged and involved. Please register online if you haven't already. Please take our survey that's online as well. Also, I want to give a acknowledgement to a couple of our elected officials that are here in the audience this evening. I want to recognize Mayor Pro Tem Drew, who's in the audience, as well as Councilwoman Eklund and Councilwoman Atlas as well. We thank them for being engaged and being involved in the process as well. Again, this is a very important issue for the community, very controversial, and so we want to make sure that we have all stakeholders involved and have their participation and input in the process. So again, thank you again for coming out. Thank you for our panel members again. And David, thank you for your presentation. You guys have a good night. Thank you.